Let's talk about secrets, specifically how not to keep them. In the world of espionage, secrecy is everything, but sometimes the best-laid plans unravel not because of enemy spies, but because the secret is so poorly kept, it might as well be printed on the front page of the morning paper. The Bay of Pigs invasion was so poorly concealed that Guatemalan newspapers reported on CIA training camps months in advance. Local journalists, tipped off by the sudden influx of Americans and mysterious military activity, published stories that left little to the imagination. Even radio stations buzzed with rumors about a coming invasion. The plan to overthrow Castro was an open secret in Latin America, but Washington acted like it was top secret. Diplomats across the region whispered about the operation, and even foreign intelligence agencies were piecing together the puzzle. Yet, in the halls of power in Washington, officials clung to the illusion of plausible deniability. The CIA, worried about Castro's leftist policies and nationalization of American businesses, decided to train Cuban exiles for a covert invasion. These exiles, many of whom had lost everything after the revolution, were desperate to reclaim their homeland. The agency promised them support, training, and a chance to strike back at Castro's regime. Their logic? It worked in Guatemala in 1954, so why not Cuba? The CIA had orchestrated a coup there with a small force and a clever propaganda campaign. They believed the same blueprint could topple Castro, underestimating the differences between the two countries. They ignored that Castro was far more popular and his military much stronger. Unlike Guatemala, where the government was isolated and unpopular, Castro had the support of the masses. His revolution had inspired hope, and his forces were battle-hardened and fiercely loyal. Kennedy inherited this plan in 1961, pressured to look tough on communism, and made last-minute changes to distance the U.S., like moving the landing site and reducing air support. He was new to the presidency, facing the Cold War's mounting tensions, and wary of a direct confrontation with the Soviet Union. These tweaks, meant to make the operation more deniable, only made it more likely to fail. The exiles would land with less support, facing a well-prepared enemy. The CIA's hope for a quick victory faded as the risks mounted and the plan's flaws became obvious. The whole thing was a copy-paste job from a different country, with none of the same conditions. The CIA failed to adapt their strategy to Cuba's unique political landscape, relying on outdated assumptions and wishful thinking. It was a plan built on wishful thinking, not reality. Decision-makers convinced themselves that Castro's regime would crumble at the first sign of invasion, ignoring the warnings of experts and the evidence piling up before them. The stage was set for disaster. As the invasion force prepared to land, the world watched, some with anticipation, others with dread. The CIA's worst-kept secret was about to become headline news, and the consequences would echo far beyond the beaches of Cuba. Operation Zapata was less a military strategy and more a fantasy. The CIA believed 1,500 exiles could land on a remote beach and spark a nationwide uprising, ignoring Castro's popularity among the poor. The plan relied on old B-26 bombers flown by exiles to destroy Castro's air force, but even this was a gamble. If the invasion failed, the exiles were supposed to escape through 80 miles of swamp to the mountains, an impossible feat. The CIA's backup plan was pure fantasy, designed to make the operation seem less reckless. Every assumption was optimistic, every risk downplayed. The plan was disconnected from Cuba's political and geographic reality. It was doomed before it began. Brigade 2506 was a patchwork of ex-soldiers, university students, and professionals, men from all walks of Cuban life, united by a single burning purpose: their hatred of Fidel Castro and the hope of reclaiming their homeland. Many had lost everything, homes, families, futures, when Castro seized power. They were young, idealistic, and desperate to believe that, with the right help, they could turn the tide of history. The CIA whisked them away to secret camps in the jungles of Guatemala, promising them not just training, but a real shot at victory. American instructors drilled them day and night, teaching them the basics of warfare, sabotage, and survival. The exiles were told they'd have the full weight of U.S. support behind them, and that their mission would be swift and decisive. But the reality was far less glamorous. Training was rushed, the equipment was often outdated or secondhand, and the men barely had time to bond as a unit. The mission's goals were never clear. Was it a lightning beach assault, or a drawn-out guerrilla campaign in the mountains? Confusion reigned, and doubts began to fester. Still, the exiles clung to hope. They trusted their American backers, believing that the U.S. would never send them on a suicide mission. Many saw the Americans as saviors, convinced that Washington would never abandon them in their hour of need. But for the Americans, this was just another move in the Cold War chess game, a way to check Soviet influence in the Western Hemisphere. For the Cubans, it was a matter of life, death, and national pride. The stakes could not have been more different. Internal divisions soon surfaced. Some wanted a quick strike, others argued for a longer campaign. The CIA struggled to keep the brigade united as personalities clashed and tempers flared. The lack of a clear plan only deepened the rifts. They were told the Cuban people would rise up in support, that U.S. air and naval power would be overwhelming, and that they'd never be left to fight alone. Every promise, every assurance, was eventually broken. The reality was a far cry from the hopeful speeches and secret briefings. These men were undeniably brave, willing to risk everything for a free Cuba. But from the very start, they were set up to fail, undermined by poor planning, false promises, and a lack of real commitment from their most powerful ally. In the end, Brigade 2506 became the tip of a spear forged from wishful thinking and political calculation, a weapon doomed to shatter the moment it struck. The invasion began on April 16, 1961 and unraveled instantly. Boats hit coral reefs, supplies sank, and the element of surprise vanished. The landing site, Playa Girón, was not isolated. Local militia and vacationers quickly sounded the alarm. Instead of a welcoming crowd, the brigade met gunfire. Castro, forewarned by spies and media leaks, responded with overwhelming force. The local population, loyal to Castro, reported the invaders' positions. The brigade was isolated, outnumbered, and cut off from supplies. Their supply ships were sunk by Castro's air force, the same planes the CIA was supposed to destroy. The operation collapsed into chaos and desperation. The invasion's success depended on air support that never arrived. Kennedy, fearing exposure, scaled back the initial bombing runs, leaving Castro's air force mostly intact. As the brigade fought on the beach, they were pounded by enemy planes, waiting for promised U.S. jets that never came. A time zone mix-up meant the limited American air support missed the battle entirely. The brigade's own bombers were outdated and quickly shot down. Kennedy refused to send in U.S. Navy jets, fearing an international incident. The men on the beach were abandoned at their most desperate moment. It was a political decision that sealed their fate. The promised cavalry never arrived. The result: total betrayal and disaster. The CIA fatally underestimated Castro. He was no pushover. He took command, rallied his troops, and turned the invasion into a national cause. Castro's forces were well-trained, well-armed, and fiercely loyal. Within a day, 20,000 troops surrounded the 1,500 exiles. The brigade was hopelessly outmatched, fighting for 3 days before surrendering. Over 100 were killed, nearly 1,200 captured. Castro's victory made him a hero, silenced opposition, and pushed Cuba further into the Soviet camp. The CIA's attempt to topple him only made him stronger. The invasion ended in total failure. The Bay of Pigs invasion quickly became a global embarrassment for the United States, making headlines around the world. What was meant to be a swift, covert operation instead turned into a public fiasco, exposing the limits of American power and planning. The world watched in disbelief as the U.S., a superpower, fumbled so spectacularly on the international stage. President John F. Kennedy, just months into his presidency, was forced to take responsibility on national television. The young, charismatic leader who had inspired hope and confidence now appeared shaken and vulnerable. His carefully crafted image as a decisive, confident leader was shattered overnight, and the American public saw a side of Kennedy that was uncertain and deeply troubled by the failure. America's allies were stunned by the amateurishness of the operation. Many questioned whether the U.S. could be trusted to lead the free world. In Latin America, suspicions of U.S. imperialism were confirmed, fueling anti-American protests and deepening resentment. The failed invasion gave ammunition to critics who argued that the United States was meddling in the affairs of its neighbors without understanding the consequences. The captured Cuban exiles who had risked everything in hopes of liberating their homeland became bargaining chips for Fidel Castro. In a dramatic turn, Castro negotiated their release in exchange for $50 million worth of food and medicine, turning the tables on the U.S. and scoring a propaganda victory for his regime. The fiasco triggered a major shakeup in the Kennedy administration. Fingers were pointed, blame was assigned, and heads rolled. Most notably, CIA Director Allen Dulles, who had overseen the operation, was forced to resign, along with several other top officials. The government was left scrambling to restore its credibility both at home and abroad. For Kennedy, the Bay of Pigs was a harsh wake-up call. He learned not to trust optimistic experts or military advisors blindly, a lesson that would profoundly shape his approach during the Cuban Missile Crisis a year later. The experience made him more cautious, more skeptical, and determined never to repeat the same mistakes. The invasion's failure was a stark reminder of the cost of arrogance and poor planning. It showed that even the most powerful nations could stumble when they underestimated their opponents and overestimated their own abilities. In the aftermath, the United States lost not only its moral high ground but also its credibility on the world stage. Allies became wary, adversaries emboldened, and the global balance of power subtly shifted. The consequences of the Bay of Pigs would echo for decades, shaping U.S. foreign policy and the course of the Cold War in ways no one could have predicted. Instead of reducing Soviet influence, the invasion pushed Cuba straight into Moscow's arms. Before the Bay of Pigs, Castro wasn't fully aligned with the Soviets. Afterward, he saw the U.S. as a mortal enemy, and welcomed Soviet aid and weapons. Khrushchev seized the chance to put missiles in Cuba, leading directly to the Cuban Missile Crisis. The world came to the brink of nuclear war, a direct result of the failed invasion. U.S.-Cuban relations froze for decades, with embargoes and failed assassination plots. The Bay of Pigs cast a shadow over both countries for generations. One bad decision nearly changed the world forever. The Bay of Pigs is a cautionary tale about believing your own hype. The CIA and Kennedy administration bought into their own myth of American exceptionalism, ignoring reality and dissent. Groupthink and arrogance led to a plan that collapsed on contact with the real world. The U.S. misunderstood the Cuban Revolution and Castro's popularity, failing to see things from the Cuban perspective. The invasion's failure was rooted in a lack of empathy and critical thinking. The lesson: question authority, challenge assumptions, and don't let ideology blind you to reality. Even the most powerful nation can stumble into disaster with a bad plan. In the end, reality always gets the last word.